At some point, most people have a moment. Not a dramatic breakdown, not a revelation with lights and music. Just a quiet, almost embarrassing realization that the rules they were handed at the beginning of the game don't seem to apply equally to everyone playing it. You did what you were supposed to do. You showed up. You tried. You followed the script. And then you looked around and noticed that the script doesn't guarantee anything. It never did. And nobody warned you about that part. This is not a video about bitterness. It's not about blaming the system or deciding that nothing matters. It's about something more specific and more interesting. What happens to a person after that moment? After the illusion breaks, what do you do with the pieces? Because that choice, the one most people make without even realizing they're making it, shapes everything that comes after. And most people, without thinking about it, choose one of two paths. One of them leads somewhere. The other just feels like it does. There is a version of life that gets handed to you early. Work hard, be patient, play by the rules. And in return, the world will be fair to you. Not perfectly fair, not immediately, but fair enough. Fair in the long run. This is not something anyone sits you down and explains explicitly. It's absorbed. It comes from parents, from school, from the general atmosphere of a society that needs people to believe in the system in order for the system to function. And the strange thing is that this promise worked. For long enough, for enough people, that it became something close to truth. There were generations that followed the script and got what the script offered. House, stability, a future that resembled the plan. So the promise spread. It became mythology. And mythology, once it settles in, doesn't need evidence anymore. It sustains itself. The problem is that mythology doesn't update itself when the conditions change. And the conditions changed. Quietly at first, then all at once in ways that were impossible to ignore. The script stopped delivering what it promised, and the people who noticed first were the ones who had the least margin for error, the ones for whom patient and long-term was never really an option to begin with. They looked at the math, and the math didn't add up. And somewhere in that gap between what was promised and what was delivered, something shifted in how an entire generation related to the future. This is where things get philosophically interesting, because the response to a broken promise is not automatic. It's a choice, and the two most common choices look almost identical from the outside. When someone genuinely internalizes that the game is not fair, that the distribution of outcomes has less to do with effort and virtue than everyone was led to believe, two things can happen inside that person. The first response is what philosophers have called nihilism. Nothing matters, so why try? The rules were a lie, the structure was a fantasy, and the only honest position is to stop pretending otherwise. There's a kind of relief in this. Initially, the weight of having to perform for a system that doesn't reward the performance is suddenly lifted. You stop trying to win a game you've decided is rigged. The problem is that nihilism doesn't actually take you anywhere. It's a destination that feels like freedom and functions like paralysis. You've diagnosed the disease correctly and prescribed doing nothing as the cure. The second response is harder to name because it's less clean, less quotable. It's the response of someone who arrives at the exact same realization. The game is not fair, the promise was conditional at best, the outcomes are messier than the mythology admitted, and then decides to keep playing anyway. Not because they've convinced themselves the game is actually fair after all, not because they found a loophole or a shortcut, but because they made a different calculation. If the game is going to be played regardless, if the alternative to playing is just watching from the outside, then they'd rather play on their own terms than not play at all. This second response has a name too. Albert Camus spent most of his philosophical life trying to describe it. In 1942, in the middle of a world war, Camus published an essay about a man condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill for eternity. Every time Sisyphus reaches the top, the rock rolls back down. He descends, he pushes again, forever. The obvious reading of this myth is that it's a punishment. The repetition, the futility, the absence of any progress. It's designed to break a person, and Camus knew that. He wasn't arguing the myth was misread. He was arguing that the conclusion most people draw from it is wrong. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because the situation changed, the rock still falls, it always falls, but because Sisyphus, at some point on that descent, made a choice that the gods didn't account for. He decided that the rock was his, the hill was his, the pushing was his. The gods gave him an eternal punishment, and he turned it into an eternal practice. And that act of turning, that refusal to let the absurdity of the situation be the final word on the meaning of his existence, is what Camus called revolt. This is the philosophical distinction that almost never makes it into the conversation when people talk about a generation that stopped believing in the system. The conversation jumps straight from the promise broke to so now nothing matters. But Camus is sitting there, in 1942, in the ruins of a Europe that had just watched its own foundational promises collapse catastrophically, saying, there is a third option. You can know that the game is rigged and still play it, as long as you're the one deciding what winning means. The difference between nihilism and absurdism is not in the diagnosis. Both look at the world clearly and see that it doesn't guarantee justice. The difference is in what you do after the seeing. Nihilism stops, absurdism moves. There is something specific that happens when an entire generation arrives at the same realization roughly at the same time. It doesn't stay philosophical, it becomes behavioral, it becomes cultural, and the behavior that emerges when millions of people simultaneously conclude that the conventional path doesn't reliably lead where it claimed to lead is not always pretty, but it's rarely random. It follows a logic. Some people double down on the mythology, insisting that the promise still holds, that patience and discipline will eventually be rewarded, because the alternative is too destabilizing to accept. Some people collapse into the nihilism we talked about, ironizing everything, committing to nothing, treating detachment as sophistication. And some people, a smaller and less visible group, make the Camusian move. They accept the unfairness not as a reason to stop, but as a clarification. If the system won't give you the life you were promised, then the project becomes building a life the system didn't promise you. That last group is interesting, not because they figured out how to win. They haven't. The rock still falls, but because they changed the relationship between themselves and the falling. They stopped waiting for the game to become fair and started asking a different question. What do I actually want to be doing while the game is what it is? This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the mythology runs deep, and detaching from it without falling into nihilism requires a kind of sustained effort that nobody really teaches. You have to grieve the promise before you can move past it. You have to sit with the unfairness long enough to stop being surprised by it. And then, on the other side of that, there's a question waiting that most people spend enormous energy avoiding. Here is what becomes possible when you fully accept that life is not going to be fair. Not as a complaint, not as a temporary setback, but as a structural feature of reality that you've genuinely integrated. What becomes possible is that you stop organizing your choices around the expectation of fairness. You stop making decisions based on what the promise said would be rewarded. And in that space, suddenly, the question of what you actually want to do with your time becomes unavoidable in a way it never was before. Most people never answer that question directly. They outsource the answer to the system. The system tells them what success looks like, what a good life looks like, what the correct sequence of milestones is, and they follow the sequence, not because they chose it, but because choosing felt less available than following. The promise gave them a map, and maps are useful because they mean you don't have to figure out where you're going. When the map turns out to be unreliable, one option is to be furious at the map makers. Another is to throw away the concept of maps entirely. But the third option, the one Camus would recognize, is to put down the map and actually look at where you are. To ask, without the distortion of what you were promised, what direction feels true to you right now, in this specific life, with these specific conditions? That is a much harder question than am I following the plan. It has no predetermined answer. It can't be outsourced. And the person who asks it seriously is going to have to live with the uncertainty that comes from not having a mythological system backing up their choices. But here's what they get in return. They get to stop being disappointed by a promise that was never unconditional to begin with. They get to stop measuring their life against a standard that was designed for different circumstances. And they get something that is genuinely rare, a relationship with their own existence that isn't mediated by whether the system is keeping its end of a bargain. The title of this video is a question, and I want to be honest that I don't have an answer to it in the way that most videos promise answers. If life isn't fair, it should at least be interesting. That sounds like a consolation prize, and maybe it is, but I think there's something more precise in it than it first appears. Interesting is not the same as entertaining. Interesting is not the same as exciting in the way that numbs you. Interesting in the sense I mean it is what happens when you are genuinely present in your own life, when the choices you're making feel like yours, when the thing you're pushing up the hill is actually your rock and not someone else's idea of what your rock should be. That is not a guarantee of happiness. Camus never promised Sisyphus was happy in the way people mean when they say they want to be happy. He was happy in the sense that the stone was his, the hill was his, the struggle was entirely and completely his own. There's a kind of dignity in that, and maybe a kind of meaning, even if the rock keeps falling. The real question, the one this video is actually asking, is not whether life is fair. It isn't. That's settled. The question is what you do with the version of life you actually have. Not the one that was promised, not the one someone else is living, not the one the map described. This one, the unfair, unguaranteed, occasionally absurd one, that is nonetheless entirely yours. That question doesn't have an answer you can get from a video, but it has an answer, and most people spend a very long time not asking it, because asking it means accepting, really accepting, that the promise was never the point. The point was always what you were going to do once you figured that out.